Forget the broomsticks. Forget the cackling. Never mind the wart-studded noses or flickering lightning from fingertips. That's a caricature of witches, layered in Halloween plastic and smothered in hundreds of years of fear-mongering. The real witches. Oh, they flew all right. They just didn't fly in the sky. They soared through minds. They flew with wit. They're real cauldrons, brains bubbling with dangerous thoughts, ideas, knowledge, questions that hit the ribcage of the status quo. And you know what, dear viewer? That sure scared the bejesus out of people. Welcome to the real history of witches. Not the fantasy, but the revolution. This is the tale of the ones who would not bend, who stirred more than potions, who looked past walls and said, "This is not right." Let's rewind the grungy film of time a bit and hit play in the Middle Ages. Back, 2 times that weren't as dark and dismal as we picture them, but where superstition clung to the walls like mold. Medicine was a medieval gamble, religion was law, and women were property, mostly. Unless, that is, they were sensible. Then they were a threat. Entered the cunning women. These were your herbalists, your midwives, your keepers of the folk. Knowledge handed down by moonlight whispers and bloodline secrets. They knew the properties of which root cured fever, which bark could lull a man to sleep, which words could make the local lord's ego crumble like stale bread. They weren't just healers, they were influencers before TikTok. Trusted, feared, envied, and gradually, particularly after the church figured out it wasn't in a position to control them, they became something else, witch. And now, calling someone a witch was no mere insult, it was an invitation to suspicion, to torture, to flames, all because someone took it upon themselves to know more than they should, or, even worse, share it. But here's the twist, the witch hunts, they weren't just about religion, they were political, they were economical, they were gender warfare. Consider, who does it serve that all landowning women, all women doctors, all women who dare to speak out, are suddenly suspect, when you could take her house when the trial was over? When to hush her up was to shut down an entire information network. It wasn't a purge of evil, it was a blackout of reason. Europe. Cray-cray, by the 15th century, then the printing press appeared, and on it, there was a book known as the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Get it, bestseller, if you can believe it. In essence, a medieval hit list, couched in theology and paranoia. It made inquisitors, famous and women, the object of suspicion. Tens of thousands were accused, tortured, burned, because they did not curse the crops but instead asked, what if we do things differently? Yet not all were women. Indeed, men were also accused, especially those who sided with these women, who questioned church teachings, who spread dangerous knowledge. But yes, women outnumbered everyone else, because society is always afraid of a woman who knows something. A quick stop in Ironyville. Some of the very women accused of witchcraft were those most responsible for keeping people alive. Midwives who saved the life of a woman in childbirth were suspected of communication with demons. It was said that people who cured fevers had sometimes created them. It was damned if you did, damned if you breathed. But that's the point. It wasn't about what they did. It wasn't just what they meant. Power without permission. And that made them dangerous. So here's what's wild. In many instances, these women knew they were threats. They knew the risk. And they kept going. They kept healing. Kept writing. Continued to gather in woods and kitchens and shadowy corners, spreading their wisdom not in defiance of the good, but because they believed knowledge should be shared. They became libraries in a world that burned books. But they didn't just resist, they adapted. They evolved. When the flames arrived, some fled, changed names, assimilated through society. They passed on their knowledge to daughters and granddaughters in lullabies and coded recipes. Even early today, you still see remnants of them. In traditions, in medicine, in feminism. You know, in the way that we observe systems and we're like, that just doesn't feel right. Because modern witches, they're not hocus pocus, they're focused. They challenge, they teach, they heal, they remember. And that's where we begin. Not with the witches they tortures, but not with the witches, the ones who were smarter than the fire. The ones who fly with wit, not broomsticks. Don't leave me, because chapter 2. Okay. We're going deep in the first fire, the spark that fomented the storm, and it's not what you think. Before the screaming, before the fire, before the ink on a single accusation had time to dry, there was a whisper, not a scream, not a sermon, A breath traversed over the lips as a match through tinder. The actual start of the witch hunts didn't involve a woman casting spells during a blood moon. It began with fear, the fear of the unexplained, dread of the famine that starved your children, dread over the plague that turned your village into a graveyard, a dread of the dud harvest that left you destitute in winter. And when fear requires a name, it gives face to it, usually a woman's. Consider this scenario: 14th century Europe, just before things got really ugly. People are dying. No one knows why. Science hasn't evolved, but fear, oh, it's doing just fine. And that's when people start searching for a scapegoat. Fear of the church, which is already at the height of its powers, is getting nervous. Citizens are looking to local healers and mystics over priests. The holy monopoly of truth is threatened. So what's the plan? Undermine the competition, paint them as evil, present their wisdom as seduction by Satan. Boom, instant villain. But here's the genuine mind-bender. Witch hunts didn't take off at once. The actual surge didn't even begin until the late 1400s. Because fear alone isn't enough. You need infrastructure. You need propaganda. Enter the Malleus Maleficarum 1. The Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1487 by a dude, Heinrich Kramer, who was so into the devil he could have had a black metal band. His book could double as a how-to guide for paranoid zealots. How to identify witches. How to extract confessions. How murder can be explained and justified as a holy work. It was a bestseller, faster than you could say heretic. It flew through Europe with the help of the printing press. The Malleus became the indispensable handbook for every man who wanted to ascend the holy ladder by crushing women beneath him. But books don't burn people. People do. And that is where superstition takes local politics down a dark alley and lights a torch. In cities and towns from Germany, France, Scotland, Switzerland, allegations began sprouting like wildfire. One woman was strange, another too smart, another had a sharp tongue, another had assisted a woman in childbirth. After the priest was unable to help, that was enough. The purpose of torture was not to find the truth, but to compel the answer everyone wanted to hear. Confess or suffer. Confess and still burn. A double bind in a silver chalice. And it was not only religious fanatics. Local leaders took notice as well. Seize property. Remove rivals. Demonstrate your piety by feeding the flames. It was a public performance, a ritual of fear clothed in righteous robes. And yet, in the midst of this horror, something peculiar occurred. As the fires burned, whispers deepened into warnings. It became the accusation that people began to fear more than the accused. People started to notice the pattern. They saw who was always being targeted: the old, the poor, the educated, the foreign, the mouthy. And that's when the resistance started to simmer. Some towns refused to participate. Some priests defended women. A few academics wrote responses to the Malleus. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the doctrine, a drip of doubt in the sea of obedience. Still, truth has a way of finding its way even inside the most closed systems. The spark beneath the ashes was more than fear. It was the primitive instinct that something was wrong. That burning a woman does not produce healthier cows. That confessions obtained through torture are theater, not truth. Real power doesn't need to silence others. So the second chapter does not conclude with a bang but with a question murmured among ruins. But what if she's not the monster? What if she's the warning? This is the chapter where the scary stuff goes from terrifying to terrifyingly bureaucratic, where paranoia is not merely a defect in the system, it is the system. Welcome to the 16th and 17th centuries, when burning witches wasn't simply an expression of fear, but a civic ritual, a whole industry, a PR stunt. And it is, in a way, a spectacle smothered in incense and screams. If chapter 2 was a match, chapter 3 is the wildfire. A wildfire with rules, bureaucracy, and yes, merchandise. Let's talk about Germany, Holy Roman Empire territory. The place would become ground zero for what we now know as peak witch panic. Whole towns like Würzburg and Bamberg were consumed by mass hysteria. We're not talking a few dozen victims here. We're talking thousands. Indeed, it's estimated that in Bamberg alone, over 600 witches, men, women, children, were put to death. Anyone who stared at the sky for too long or had too many cats. Why? Because it worked. Because it maintained order. It provided local rulers a handy pretense to cleanse debtors, stifle unrest, and enhanced religious credibility. And let's not forget Scotland, the home of tartan, bagpipes, and one of Europe's highest per capita rates of cross-burning. Over 4,000 people tried, 2/3 of them executed, frequently on the basis of spectral evidence, visions, dreams. I saw her in a dream feeding my baby to a bat. That level of courtroom logic. But not only was it happening in the backwoods, King James VI of Scotland, the very same who was responsible for the King James Bible, authored one called Demonology. He was obsessed. His paranoia became policy. He thought witches conspired to drown him at sea. The result, influence, the hunts were legal as a result of the royal decree. They burned witches alive in France, except in Poland, where they drowned them first to see if they'd float, because clearly, buoyancy is blasphemy. In England, the notorious witch-finder general, Matthew Hopkins, made witch hunting a lucrative business. Pay me and I'll find your village witch. If he couldn't find one, he invented one. Capitalism meets cruelty. Hang for 1 second while we unpack this. How do you industrialize fear? Step 1. Create a myth. Make witches the ultimate threat. Step 2. Create doctrine out of the myth. Step 3. Pay people for imagining that they are seeing witches where no witches are. Step 4. Profit. The witch craze became performative. Burnings were planned like theater performances. Vendors sold food. Families brought children. It wasn't just execution. It was entertainment. Public. Ritualized. Normalized. Imagine that. Watching a woman burn and then going home with a sausage and a sermon. And here's the cruel turn. A few were still fighting back. Lawyers, theologians, skeptics, and even royalty. They questioned the process, the legality, the morality. Others would not implement witchcraft laws at all. Even the Spanish Inquisition, yes, that Spanish Inquisition frequently rejected witch trials for lack of evidence. And it turns out they were more into heretics than herbalists. So what's happening here? Really, this wasn't about witches. It was about obedience, control, identifying a scapegoat to be hated and reviled by all. Witches were not the agents of chaos. They were the excuse. And behind every excuse, a system, a machine built to muzzle, to grab, to intimidate. And if machines have cogs, it had the informers, the torturers, the judges, the neighbors who whispered your name so that you would be the one they took away and they would not be the one to be taken away themselves. It became fashionable not to be accusing someone. And that, folks, is how fear becomes fashion. When it's hard to tell faith from fanaticism. When mob-think crowds out morality. When justice puts on a mask and spews out fire. But every machine has a flaw, a crack, a weakness. The witch-hunting mania had one as well. It got too greedy, too loud, too obvious. The people who had helped start the fire began to get burned by it. Nobles, clergy, the wealthy. And something strange happened. People stopped cheering and started asking questions. Wait, why is she being charged? Doubt crept in like smoke. And that doubt will be our theme in Chapter 4. The tide starts to turn. Because history always swings. And the pendulum was about to swing back with a vengeance. And then, in the late 1600s, something odd started to take place. The fire was still on fire, but less people warming their hands by it. The crowds got quieter. The accusations got questioned. The confessions, so many times celebrated as divine victories, began to ring hollow, rehearsed, forced, convenient, Then, suddenly, the air changed. Doubt, bozness as smoke, filtered into every part of the system. And never mind that a police department with nothing to prove would proceed with the amount of insistence and extravagance that the Wiccans said they did. What appeared to be righteous indignation was now creeping into organized hysteria. Because when you burn 100 people from the same village, someone eventually wonders, who's left to curse us now? Let's focus in on the notorious Salem witch trials. Yes, America had its own little taste of the hysteria. Massachusetts, 1692. Puritans, panic, teenage girls, and accusations swirling like arrows in a blizzard. 19 people hanged. One man, Giles Corey, pressed to death with stones. Dozens imprisoned. Why? Coincidentally, a couple young girls said they had had visions, were in agony, saw spectral animals, and when the courts decided that type of evidence would be acceptable, all hell broke loose. But there's a twist in the plot. It was over almost as soon as it began. Why? Because people began to question whom, exactly, was being accused. respectable folks, ministers, wealthy landowners. Now, the targets were not just the weird old widow down the road. They were insiders, and insiders getting accused. That made people nervous. That it was only after Massachusetts Governor William Phips intervened and halted the frenzy that spectral evidence was deemed inadmissible. That hysteria was defanged overnight, and the witch trials, they ground to a halt. But Salem was just an ember in a much larger fire. Through Europe, the same thing happened. Fire drang, then fatigue. There, in Germany, after decades of carnage, towns began to refuse to attend. The Holy Roman Empire began to regard witch trials not as saints' work, but as harmful. A few scholars and officials did speak up. They published treatises. They challenged the logic. They demanded actual evidence. In France, famous magistrate Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie began studying the cases of witch trials and made a discovery that was fraught with irregularities. By and large, most accusations, he determined, were driven by fear, not fact. In England, skepticism grew louder. The trial of Jane Wenham in 1712 was among the last of its kind. That was despite the judge hearing evidence in the negative about her, and to my mind he clearly thought the whole nonsense was absurd. She was convicted, and then quietly pardoned. The pendulum was swinging. What fueled this shift? Let's count the sparks. Education. With the spread of literacy and the proliferation of universities, people came to insist on logic trumping law. Science was no longer just for monks. Doctors and philosophers stepped up. Astronomy replaced astrologer. Medicine replaced magic. Printing press. Pushback. If madness could be spread by the Malleus Maleficarum, other books could now spread reason for aristocratic patrons. Writers like Reginald Scott in England and Johann Weyer in Germany published skeptical texts that explained why witch-hunting reasoning did not make sense. Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft 1584 didn't only denounce the superstition, it ridiculed it. Royal about-face monarchs who had once fanned the flames started dousing them. English hanged their last witches in 1682. In 1735 the Witchcraft Act was enacted, though not to persecute witches, but to persecute those pretending to be witches. If there ever was a legal about-face, Enlightenment may be the last nail in the coffin. An era that prized reason, curiosity, and skepticism. Philosophers such as Voltaire and Locke didn't merely call into question witch trials, they challenged the institutions that made them possible. The world was changing, and with it, the notion of witches changed as well. They were no longer scapegoats, they were symbols of resistance, of survival, of the power that terrified the patriarchy. But before we pat humanity on the back and say good job, let's be real. The witch hunts didn't just disappear, they morphed. Accusation culture still lives. We just call it something else. And some of those same dynamics, the silencing, the blaming, the public shaming still reverberate through headlines and hashtags. Still, Chapter 4 is our oasis. The place in the story where reason hobbles out on the stage. Bloodied, sure. Burned, definitely. But alive. And in Chapter 5, we adjust the lens entirely. Because now that those gigarask raindrops are beginning to fall, we must ask, who survived the hunt, and what did they leave us? Because witches didn't disappear, they evolved, and their legacy, it is stranger, and it is more powerful than anything the Inquisitors ever dreamt of. When the fire smoldered away, the only thing left wasn't ash. It was quiet, heavy, dense, the sort of silence that isn't an absence but a presence. An aura of stories untold, names uncleared, wisdom not passed down. The witch hunts might have been disempowered legally, but the cultural wound still cut to the bone, and out of those scars grew something unexpected. Not just survival, but evolution. Let's talk legacy, because an archetype is not something you can squelch. You can suffocate it, corrupt it, weaponize it, but it always finds a way to persist. The witch, the wise woman, the renegade, the healer, she never disappeared. She went underground, into grandmothers' kitchens, into whispered ceremonies and secret herbs, into lullabies that held coded knowledge, the first form of survival, oral tradition. Forget books, those were burned. Songs, recipes, gestures, those were the USB drives of the predigital moment. In Italian villages, midwives continued to pass on birthing wisdom through hand signs and chants. In Slavic countries, babki applied healing poultices and uttered prayers harking back to pre-Christian paganism. In Africa, syncretic religions like Vodun and Santeria, mixed ancestral knowledge with colonial Christianity simply to stay alive. What the church had formerly condemned as devil's work was in fact memory work. Stereotypical information is woven deep beneath myth, rhyme and rhythm. The second form of survival, reinvention. Women and men started doing their healing and spiritual work in acceptable roles. The herbalist became the apothecary, the mystic became the nun, the seer became the storyteller. The same knowledge, new packaging, and then there were the outlaws, the ones who said, to hell with blending in. The 19th century gave rise to many European occultist groups. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Women like Helena Blavatsky didn't just reclaim magic, they published it. Rituals, cosmology, tarot, astrology, all of it was re-exposed in public. What was once quietly circulated was now bought in hardcover. The third wave, feminism. By the 1960s and 70s, witches experienced a renaissance, not as menaces, but as muses. The feminist movement took the witch back as symbol of ultimate female autonomy and rebellion. Women started wearing black not as a symbol of mourning, but as a way to become powerful. It was the content of books like Witches, Midwives, and Nurses by Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English that rewrote the story. Witches weren't evil at all. They were healers who were slain by patriarchal systems. Also, you get it in pop culture, from Glinda the Good Witch to the Charmed Sisters to Wanda Maximoff. Witches ceased to be horror, they were heroes, complicated, flawed, powerful, still feared, but also admired. Even now, the word which carries an exquisite duality of sting. Call someone a witch, and you could be provoking them or praising them. Depends who you ask. The witchcraft of today, in all its different forms, Wicca, folk magic, kitchen witchery, chaos magic, isn't about flying brooms or summoning the devil. It's about reclaiming choice, reclaiming rituals, creating meaning inside a world that is incessantly trying to sell you someone else's truth. It's also about justice. A lot of contemporary witches are living an activist's lifestyle. Their altar is more than a receptacle for candles. It is a site of intention, resistance, remembrance. We don't cast spells for love potions. We cast them for focus, for healing, for protest. And it's no accident that witchcraft is re-emerging now in a time of disillusionment. When institutions weaken, people revert to instinct. When science is distorted in the service of profit, people turn to plants and energy. When institutions mute, people seek symbols. And the witch, she's the ultimate symbol, not of evil, of choice, of boundaries, of mystery, of being alone in a world that punishes difference. So what did the accused witches leave us? Not just spells and potions, they also left a blueprint for resistance. They taught us to question, to feel the rhythm no algorithm could describe. They showed us that to be feared isn't always a curse. It is sometimes a sign that something is going right. And perhaps, just perhaps, they remain here. In the ones who inquire inconveniently. In the ones who get better without asking. In the ones who defend, who incite, who preserve. Chapter 6. We're diving headfirst into the origins of contemporary witchcraft. Strap in, this is not your granny's grimoire. Or maybe it is. Let's reach beneath the tarot cards and sage bundles and really dirty our hands. Because modern witchcraft as we know it isn't modern at all. It's ancient wisdom in new boots. It's defiance, healing, mysticism, science, and culture all thrown into a big potluck dinner, where everyone's invited and nobody's apologizing. The new witchy moment is about more than incense and moon water. It's about structure, practice, reconnection, and most of all, reclamation. Taking back rituals that were yanked out of the hands of wise women, redefining names sullied by thousands of years of terror, taking back the power that was always ours, but criminalized when it got too loud. Let's start with Wicca, born in the middle of the 20th century and popularized by Gerald Gardner, incorporated ancient pagan practices, folklore, and ceremonial magic. Gardner wasn't creating magic, he was marketing it, making it palatable, accessible, legal. Wicca provided a structure for spiritual rebels, a means to harness attention, to honor the natural world, to form connections to something beyond dogma. It focused on the feminine divine, sacred cycles and seasonal festivals such as Samhain and Beltane. From the outside, it appeared to be cosplay with candles, but to the wielder, this was an identity, a revival. a return. And that revival caught fire. Soon, variants propagated. Green witchcraft, which focused on plants and nature. Kitchen witchery, where cookery was magic. Chaos magic, with its nothing is true, everything is permitted ethos. Afro-diasporic traditions such as hoodoo, conjure, Ifa, also became acknowledged, and was no longer shrugged off or erased as superstition, but granted the authority of its position as actual spiritual systems with ancient lineage. Enter the 21st century. Now we've got digital covens, spell tutorials on TikTok, astrology memes as resistance, witchcraft as wellness, as protest, as therapy. For others, it's a spiritual journey. For others, it's a toolkit. For many, it's both. But what's the core? Intention, ritual, autonomy. Witchcraft today isn't a one book, one rule, one robe proposition. It's radically plural, personal, intersectional. It asks questions, not obedience. It celebrates the ancestors and the algorithms. Yes, there's commodity, crystals, mass mind, big brand witch starter kits. Instagram spells more with filters than with function. But something genuine pulses beneath that glossy veneer. Because contemporary witches do not reenact. They are innovators. They write new spells, break old curses, chisel out rituals from trauma, and use grief as power. They organize. They protest. They burn candles for sisters killed. They curse rape culture and bless trans lives. Witchcraft is no longer muttered in shame. It's sworn in joy, danced in protest, hollered in solidarity. It's in books, yes, but it's also in birth centers, in community gardens, in queer collectives, in mental health practices. It's not any one thing, because it never was. That's the point. Magic lives in the margins, and the witch, she struts those margins as if it were a runway. Some say witchcraft is a fad, but fads don't survive burnings. Fads do not get buried in mass graves and continue to rise. Fads do not rewrite history. They respond to it. This is a response, a resurrection, a revolution in a cloak of velvet, spices, and primal thunder. Chapter 7. We're going deeper into symbols, pentagrams, and potions, and familiars, and flying ointments, not the Halloween kind, the historical kind, where mythology meets scientific method, and symbols serve as instruments of survival. If magic is the language of intuition, symbols are its letters, and witches, they speak it fluently. You know what I'm talking about. Pentagrams, potions, black cats, cauldrons, flying broomsticks, shadowy familiars sitting on shoulders. So, where did these come from? Who granted these symbols power, and why do we still have them? Let's decode. The pentagram, 5 points. Easily, one of the most misunderstood symbols in Western magic. Hollywood can't get enough of flipping it on its head and slapping it on demon summoning circles. But upright, the pentagram is a symbol of equilibrium, spirit, water, fire, earth, air. It was holy well before Christianity, well before they began to vilify witches. Pythagoreans adopted it as a symbol for mathematics, as well as the soul. It was worn by medieval magicians to keep themselves safe. The church, they loathed how much people adored it, so they turned it upside down, demonized it, and poured the image into the burning engine of fear. But modern witches reclaimed it. Now, it's something of a badge of identity, a rebellion against binary thinking. Highly recommended spiritual guide for journeyers with twisted paths. The cauldron. No, it's not just a pot. It's womb. Well, forge. The place where things are dismantled and reborn. The cauldron of Ceridwen was one of wisdom in Celtic myth. The crucible is the chamber of transformation in alchemy. Witches didn't merely use the cauldron to brew. They used it to transmute, make herbs into healing, trauma into ritual. It's not so much boiling frogs as boiling off illusions, flying ointments and broomsticks. And this is where it gets spicy. During the Middle Ages, some witches made herbal salves, flying ointments, using psychoactive plants such as belladonna, henbane, and mandrake. These weren't party drugs. They were for visions, trance states, journeying beyond the veil. And the application method, What? According to folklore, they flew on broomsticks. Yes, really. There is a theory that they smeared wooden poles with it and then sat on the timber, allowing the ointment to be absorbed through their mucous membranes. Cue the church, which perverted this into the proof of kinky Sabbaths and demon flight. Thus was born the image of witches flying through the air on broomsticks. Half pharmacology, half propaganda. Familiars, black cats, toads, ravens, ferrets. Animals long associated with witches were regarded as familiars, psychic companions, often demons in disguise in the assessment of accusers, sometimes guides or protectors according to practitioners. The truth is, these were frequently simply beloved animals, companions. But because these animals were around for rituals or in times of isolation, they drew the suspicion of people, and people they threw their own fears onto fur and feathers. Herbs and potions, the mandrake roots that scream, belladonna that widens pupils, mugwort for dreams, elderberry for immunity. Plants were, and are the, original pharmacy. Witches knew this. They were scientists when science still wore a lab coat. Of course, a potion could easily be something like a tea, a tincture, some kind of healing brew, but anything unfamiliar once again became suspect, especially if it worked so. Then why do these symbols persist? For they weren't just tools, they were messages. The broomstick, elevation; the cauldron, transformation; the pentagram, harmony; the cat, instinct; the herbs, empowerment. Just about everything was both real and symbolic, useful and sacred, and, even more important, each had been claimed, vilified, and then claimed once more. A cycle of cultural tug-of-war that today's witches navigate with nuance and pride. Today, symbols are still spells. A necklace with a sigil can signal safety. A snake tattoo could symbolize casting off former selves. Burning herbs is not woo-woo, it's energetic. Housekeeping.n, when a contemporary witch draws a circle in salt or chalk or intention, she's not playing dress-up for Halloween. She's defining the parameters of what's allowed in her space and what's not. That's power. Simple, symbolic, subversive. Chapter 8 brings us into the ritual's heart. What, then, does a spell in the modern sense actually look like? How is magic created, not in fiction, but in reality? Because now that we recognize all those symbols, it's time to witness them in movement. Get your hands in the dirt and your mind out of the movies. This is not waving wands and shouting Latin. This is ritual, intention, focus, layered symbolism. In the actual world, magic means less pageantry and more patterning. It's a process, and like any craft, it's a matter of skill, not sparkles. So, what is a modern spell? Short version: a deliberate action that affects change, with intent, using a symbol. Long answer: it's a psychological ritual, a spiritual commitment, a protest, a poem, a template for transmogrification outwardly in some cases, inwardly in many others. Let's break down the anatomy. The space. Space is sanctified before anything occurs. That might be the full altar with crystals, bones, candles, and icons, or a clean floor, a cup of tea and silence. Why? Because environment matters. It frames the focus. A consecrated space says, here is something that is not the rest of the world. This is not scrolling. This is not chores. This is presence, the tools, wand, atham, ritual knife, chalice, pentacle, bell, or none of these. It might be a pen, a thread, a match, or a rock from your grandmother's garden. Tools are the proxies for extension of will. The wand directs energy. The knife cuts psychic ties. The chalice holds intention. The herbs assist healing. The candle converts thought into light. It's not about owning the correct things. It's about using meaningful things. The circle. Most witches will cast a circle, a kind of psychic or energetic barrier. This is not a case of locking up or out spirits. It's a matter of separating ritual space from mundane space, between sacred and mundane, like putting on your performance clothes before the show. The invocation, calling in ancestors, spirits, archetypes, or simply grounding oneself. It could be verbal, musical, silence. Some invoke deities, others call on forces: earth, fire, intention, love, courage. The point. Connection, the act. This is where the magic is made. Write a name and burn it. Say words into water and drink it. Wind a thread of fortune around a spoken wish. Anoint and light a candle. The action is physical, but the meaning is psychological, spiritual, metaphorical. It's not so much whether lighting a candle changes the universe, and more whether it changes your own spirit, resolve, conviction. The closing, release the circle. Thank the spirits. Ground yourself, for magic is a state. You enter it, you do the work, then you exit it. Stay too long in ritual mode without grounding. The world gets fuzzy. Balance is a piece of the process. Spell types, protection, lines of salt, sigils, black candles, think boundaries, psychic armor, manifestation, green candles, coins, affirmations, focused on abundance and growth, banishing, fire spells, cord cutting, vinegar jars, removing harmful energies or habits, healing, herbal sachets, baths, moon water, healing emotional wounds, sometimes with some help from self-care. Is it real? That depends on your definition of real, as in real equals that which the instruments can measure. Sometimes no. If talking about real in the sense of impacting the mind, body, behavior, and spirit, absolutely. Now modern psychology supports it. Ritual improves focus. Symbols anchor intention. Repetition builds resilience. Placebo effect. Maybe. But if it works, what's the harm in using a placebo? Witches knew long before science did. Belief can move mountains, or at least help you climb them. Digital witchcraft. Yes, it's a thing. People cast spells via email, build altars on Pinterest, share tarot spreads on Instagram. There are entire TikTok hashtags about hexing the patriarchy. This isn't diluting magic, it's evolving it. People are where the ritual is. And today, they're online. The golden rule. There is no one way, no one book, no one gatekeeper. The magic of the new is plural, reflexive, deeper than skin. It changes with the witch, because magic isn't about control, it's about connection, to intention, to self, to cycles, to resistance, to release. Up next, in Chapter 9, the witches in pop culture. The ways movies, fiction and fantasy shaped the witch over and over, sometimes in admiration, often in desire. Ready to meet the silver screen sisters and storybook sorceresses. Witches have always lived in stories, but after Hollywood got their hands on them, well, things got strange. Sometimes they're wise, sometimes wicked, sometimes both. But one thing is for sure, as much as the witch has been manipulated by various inquisitions, pop culture has probably done more to shape how we think of witches, and not always in complimentary ways. Let's go back to the earliest glimmers of film. Early cinema and the cackling crone witches had already been villains of sorts before people even spoke in movies. Ugly, hooded, wild-eyed, they existed too. Be defeated evidence of evil in a world that wanted black and white, good guys and bad guys. Think Hickson, 1922. Part documentary, part surreal nightmare. It depicted witches as victims of hysteria, but was still billed as satanic spectacle. Then came Disney. Snow White's Evil Queen, 1937, delivered the archetype of the witch vein, potent and monstrous when her secret was out. Poison Apple, transformation, cloak and cackle. This wasn't just storytelling, it was moral coding. A powerful woman must be punished. Cue decades of damage. In popular culture, witches were made shorthand for female ambition run amok. Ursula in The Little Mermaid, the Wicked Witch of the West, Maleficent. And these weren't merely villains, they were villains who were punished for being powerful, independent, angry. But witches don't spend long in boxes. Cue the 60s and 70s. Feminism begins to bubble. Enter Bewitched, the irresistible housewife, which Samantha, who had to hide her witchcraft in order to keep her marriage intact. Even as the show made witches lovable, it also made them sweet, funny, benevolent, as long as they remained normal. Then came The Craft, 1996. Game changer. Teenage girls, trauma, power, friendship, and fallout. These witches weren't cute. They were angry, broken, complicated. They transformed witchcraft into a survival tool and, at times, a weapon. Then came Charmed, Buffy, and Sabrina. Witchcraft became cool, edgy, sexy, but there was always a catch. Wield this power responsibly. Don't let them consume you. Don't want too much. Don't get mad, because if you do, you become the bad guy all over again. Witchcraft and feminism in the movies. Witch stories aren't just spooky. They're social. Practical magic gave us sisterhood. The love which brought us satire. American Horror Story. Coven provided us with vengeance and vanity, race and resurrection. These weren't mere spells, they were metaphors. There is a recurring theme of identity, legacy, rage and visibility. We weren't just watching witches, we were watching women take up space, trauma, voice, and lately, the witch is officially back. big time. Series like Lunar Nera, Simpri, and Salem have touched on colonization, race, rebellion, WandaVision, elevated Scarlet Witch from sidekick to icon, of grief, of power, of narrative dominion. Even Encanto plays in the witchy waters, magical families, healing rituals, the power of intuition, unspoken burdens. Call it magic, call it metaphor, either way, it's witchcraft in disguise. Why witches work in stories? Because witches are contradictory, feminine and dangerous, sacred and profane, nurturing and wrathful. They don't fit, and that's why they endure. They challenge every genre. They offer power with consequence. They are a mirror of what society itself most fears, freedom. A witch on the screen isn't simply casting a spell, she's questioning the script, and that's why storytellers go back to her, time and time again, not to contain her, but to see what happens when she refuses to be bottled in. Here's the grim news. Witch hunts didn't stop, they just rebranded. We're not going to drag you into the village square and light you on fire, but reputations can smolder just as fiercely, and the court of public opinion is faster than any medieval tribunal could fantasize. This is Witch Hunt 2.0, fueled by headlines, hashtags, algorithms and anxiety. Let's give it a name: social crucifixion, cancel culture, trial by internet, whisper networks, outrage mobs. It's all very modern, but the bones are ancient. Same strategy, different tools, same thirst for purity, same fear of power, same joy in public punishment. But who gets hunted now? Still women, still the outspoken, still the ones who disrupt. Yet still there are those who are saying, that's wrong, or that does not work for me. Yet there are still those who won't play the game the right way. Contemporary witches, as they may or may not identify themselves, are the ones last in line to a tradition, holding a lit match to an instruction book written entirely in questions. The workplace witch hunt. There's a witch hunt in corporate America. Corporate America still tortures its people, but flames are so last century. With exclusion, with reputational sabotage, followed by soft words like difficult or abrasive. Strong woman must be a threat, boundary setter must be uncooperative, creative thinker must be too out there. It's the same playbook, with better lighting. Digital trials, no appeals. The global case against witchcraft. The internet has democratized the Inquisition. Anyone can now start a witch hunt with just the phone in their pocket. Accusations go viral. Context evaporates. Nuance dies. Sometimes it's justified. Real harm gets exposed. But sometimes it's projection, vendetta, or just plain boredom. It's the same result. A public shaming spectacle, replete with commentary, meme reactions, and cries for exile. We're not asking, is this person genuinely dangerous? We think, do I want to be the kind of person who's seen defending them? Silence becomes guilt. Defense becomes complicity. Apology becomes proof. Burn first, ask later. Cultural scapegoating. And we must not forget the larger enemies. Communities of color, LGBTQ+ individuals, immigrants. The other, still incriminated of corrupting the children, still blamed for the culture, still blamed for what curses remained, economic, moral, political. Witch hunts always require scapegoats, still do. The good news: resistance runneth over. The witches of today are not so easy to burn, because they're networked, because they remember, and because they've hijacked the old symbols of persecution and made them shields. Each time someone says you are too loud, and they get louder. Every time somebody says you should show more gratitude, and they want even more. Every time somebody says don't be difficult, and they say watch me. That's survival. That's history repeating and rewriting itself. How to identify a witch hunt today? It moves fast. It ignores nuance. It rewards outrage over resolution. It thrives on spectacle. It turns a person into a symbol. It burns first, asks later. Sound familiar? It should. The goal is not to excuse harm. The idea is to keep the pendulum from turning into a wrecking ball. Since today's witches are not yesterday's villains, they are what we get when history refuses to repeat. Gently. Let's start with the thing most accused witches throughout history have been known for: healing. In medieval and early modern Europe, medicine was an esoteric, exclusive world. A primarily male, university-educated, expensive medical profession, catered to the wealthy. For everyone else, there was the village healer. frequently an older woman, occasionally a widow or midwife. Here the only line of defense against infections, injuries, things needing to be pulled out, or babies not coming out at all. These were women who knew how to do things. They knew how to herbalism, yarrow, mugwort, wormwood, and comfrey, elbowing out turmeric and goji berries in your home garden. They were actual remedies that had anti-inflammatory, analgesic, or antiseptic properties. Fertility and pregnancy. Midwives understood turning breech babies, when to cut cords, how to stop bleeding after birth. They also shared contraceptive recipes, frequently spiritual health. Sometimes people are down with illness and they don't always receive treatment with herbs. At other times, it was believed a spiritual imbalance. The healer may utter prayers, burn purifying herbs, or prepare amulets. These women were, too many, saints. But in the eyes of the church or the fledgling medical establishment, they were rivals. There was no framework that they fall under, and that made them dangerous. So when a lord's son died, or a bishop's crop failed, it was easy to point the finger at the woman who boiled herbs beneath the moon. Her wisdom, once it was sought, was now seen with suspicion. But these women were not devils, they were survivors. Forget the cartoonish broomstick. Let's discuss the true instruments wielded by historical witches in their hands and huts. The grimoire or spellbook. Not all witches had them, but those who did, kept them in the family. In these handwritten books were remedies, spells, charts of the moon, and forms of ritual. More were utilitarian than demonic, something like a rural notebook. Herbal kits, dried plants in batches, flasks of tinctures, mortar and pestles, and woven charms. They were no more miraculous than a contemporary medicine cabinet, but instead of science, they were based on trial, error and folk tradition. Cauldrons and kettles, cooking, brewing, fat or wax melting, and cloth dyeing. The cauldron was a medieval crockpot, integral to a woman's household authority. It got associated with witchcraft, not for its purpose, but for what it symbolizes: transformation. Broomsticks, yes, really, at least some such brews, which would be made from ingredients like belladonna or datura, both of which can be hallucinogenic, and others with astringent and volatile compounds like ergot and popped seeds. We know from history to have been used as sapsize, either rubbed directly into the skin or spread over it with sticks. Such riding could have been based on trance states induced during ritual. It had nothing to do with flying. It had to do with altered consciousness. These weren't witchy tools, in the sense of black magic. They were realities of what women had. Misapplied instruments seemed to be proof of invented crimes. And not all witches were pagan, or were extremely spiritual, for that matter. But many had belief systems centered on nature and cycles, lunar and seasonal cycles. The moon influenced the time for planting, harvesting, menstruation, and rituals. Holidays such as Beltane May Day, Samhain, Halloween, and Imbolc Midwinter signified the changing of the seasons, periods of liminality, of doors that opened between worlds, spirits and ancestors. A lot of witches were mediums, not in a seance way, but in the way that linked the living with the dead. They respected their ancestors, provided food or candles, and believed that the dead would have advice. Protective magic. Spells weren't just for hexing. Commonly, they were for protection. A mother could chant spells to guard her child against illness. A farmer may plant a carved sigil by her field to keep safety from blight. Sympathetic magic. In accordance with similia similibus, for instance, a thorn could be employed to prick as pain in a curse, or honey in a love spell. This notion was not irrational, it was symbolic, and it was part of a perfectly coherent worldview. Were these women flinging fireballs or raising demons? No, but they were using language, symbol, and ritual to understand and survive in a world that often denied th. Although most of the accused witches were women, male witches are historically documented. Aristotle explicitly connected women with witchcraft, describing women with too much black bile in her system as more prone to witchcraft. And in this, the writings of Aristotle and his anti-scientific views on women is common among witch-hunting motifs. The theme of women being more likely to fall to floor and then become witches via its destroyer. Jealousy, lust, etc. Whether they worked as cunning men, wizards, or folk magicians, they were generally afforded a bit more leeway, especially if they helped to uphold the patriarchal order. Some men worked as astrologers, alchemists, or even ceremonial magicians, all deemed more intellectual and therefore more palatable than women's magic. which was categorized as emotional or intuitive. Male witches, however, were still being burned and hanged and tortured, especially in places like Iceland, where more men were executed during witch trials than women. There were also allies, neighbors who shielded accused women, whole villages that declined to cooperate with inquisitions. Witchcraft was not only gendered, it was also about class, independence, and fear of the unknown. So what does a witch hunt look like? They weren't, as one might be led to believe, all mobs with pitchforks. Most witch hunts were conducted by legal courts, secular and ecclesiastical. They followed procedure. They wrote confessions. They kept records. The steps can be horrifyingly detailed. Accusation: anyone could accuse anyone, often triggered by a sudden death or illness, a crop failure or drought, a personal feud, an anomaly. Cow's milk was dry. A child was plagued with nightmares. Accusers were often neighbors, and in the most proximate cases, family. Arrest and interrogation: those charged, generally women, were arrested and shackled and thrown into isolation. Interrogations were brutal. Most were tortured. Common tortures included husband and wife flogged in public, strapado suspending the body and smacking at feet, thumbs, the rack, and iron shoes. Exhaustion, chill, and terror. The goal: a confession. Torture was justified by the claim that witches had supernatural resistance to pain. Confession and naming others when they were broken. The majority of guilty respondents confessed to anything put to them by their interrogators. Flying to Sabbaths. Kissing the devil's backside, killing children, turning into animals. They were also made to name other witches, frequently friends, midwives, or enemies. And so the fire spread. Trial and sentencing: trials were often quick. Juries had little doubt. If you floated, it was evidence of your guilt. If you went down, you were innocent and most likely dead. Evidence included devils, marks, birthmarks or scars, spectral evidence, dreams or visions, animal companions, cats, dogs, toads. Penalties varied from public shaming to execution. The most dramatic was burning at the stake, but hanging, drowning, and beheading were all relatively common. Historians believe that between the 15th and 18th centuries, about 50,000 to 100,000 people were killed for witchcraft in Europe and colonial America. 75 to 85% of them were women. Most were over 40. They were, for the most part, unmarried, widowed, or poor. Frequently, they knew about herbs, midwifery, or folk medicine. The scale in some regions was staggering. Germany, over 25,000 executions. Scotland, almost 4,000 accused, highest per capita in Europe. Switzerland and France, whole towns leveled. Colonial America, the 1692 trials in Salem were tragic, but contained, as it turned out, less violent than those in Europe. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic. 1. The Church, both of the Roman Catholic and of the Protestant varieties, was centrally complicit in determining that witchcraft was diabolical. Sermons stoked fear. Clerics gave spiritual justification. Confessions were offered as evidence that Satan was a thing. But some priests attempted to thwart the hunts ironically. In Spain and elsewhere, inquisitors treated wild accusations with skepticism and frequently discounted them. But their power had its limits. The state control of witch trials by secular courts became more common. Local judges, mayorates, and magistrates stoked the hunts, often for political or commercial reasons. Some monarchs used witch trials to eliminate dissidents, reassert control, seize the property and lands of the accused. Witchcraft wasn't just terrifying, it paid well. Science and the law, even emerging science, was twisted. Evidence of witchcraft involved trials for witches' marks, floating trials, and the weighing of souls. Burden of proof was typically in a C-no. Joe Shara, Mark SNETWLJ, and if accused, you had to prove your innocence, an impossible task. And so we'll stop off in Salem, Mass. 1692. In a strict Puritan colony, young girls started experiencing bizarre fits. They screamed, writhed, and accused local women of bewitching them. The result: 200 accused, 19 executed by hanging, 1 human crushed to death by rock, several died in jail. What caused it? Psychological pressure, religious extremism, toxic mold theories, ergot, sexism, and land disputes. Salem was not the biggest witch hunt, but it would become an emblem of how fear can eclipse justice, and how ordinary human beings can unleash horrors in the name of righteousness. By the late 17th century, doubt crept in. Philosophers, such as Baruch Spinoza, Voltaire, and Thomas Hobbes, began to challenge the rationality of witch trials. Scientific revolutions revealed natural causes for disease and weather. Courts started to require real evidence. It was the Enlightenment reason at last that finally did the trick. Genes? Of course not. They never disappear. But, in time, witch trials disappeared from Europe. The last known person to have been executed was in Switzerland in 1782, but remnants of these fears remained in laws, in prejudice, in cultural memory. Our earliest representations of witches aren't found where you might expect, not in grand cathedrals or tapestries, but in the margins of books. The broomstick myth begins the earliest. Surviving image of a witch on a broomstick dates to the 1450s, but it wasn't meant to be whimsical. In these drawings, women are flying through the night with their hair running wild. Some are holding staffs, cauldrons, or cats. The majority of times were unclothed, surrounded by a mob of demonic beings. This was not illustrations of magic. This was warning, a visual language designed to instruct in fear. The broomstick was instead reinvented as a totem of deviancy, belied by an object that had always had quotidian domestic utility in rituals and herbal medicine. It was a woman's everyday item, now weaponized. The Sabbat and the Sinahas. Christian authorities elaborated their vision of diabolical witchcraft. They painted a picture of nighttime orgies called sabbats, or gatherings where witches reportedly worshipped the devil danced backward. 8 babies flew through the skies. These sensational accounts were echoed in woodcuts and pamphlets distributed more widely after the invention of the printing press. The propaganda war against the wisdom of women was waged in its early days, not just in the courtroom, but in images. And those images stuck. If there's one cultural redoubt, the witch has outlived the longest and loudest. It's in fairy tales. Let's consider how centuries of oral folklore meant to guide and instruct were consigned to the role of cautionary tales with the witch as that caution. Hansel and Gretel, Germany, an age of hunger and survival. 2 children lost in the woods stumble upon a candy-covered house. There resides an old cannibalistic woman, the witch. She lures with sweetness, represents temptation, is burned in her own oven. A poetical inversion of the counterproductive witch trial executions. But what does she symbolize? Shortages. The tale came to prominence in times of starvation. Female autonomy. The witch lives alone. She's in control of her space. Maternal inversion. She is the bad mother, the very antithesis of nurturing. Baba Yaga, Slavic folklore in Eastern Europe. The witch is not always wicked, but she is powerful. Baba Yaga lives in a hut on chicken's legs, flies on a pestle, sails in a mortar, provides assistance or the death of a hero. As the hero behaves, she is mysterious, difficult to categorize, demanding. This intricacy was gradually flattened in Western retellings. Snow White and the Evil Queen only. By the time the Brothers Grimm published their tales in the 19th century, did the witch become that aging, jealous woman, obsessed with youth and power? She uses potions and mirrors, disguises and poisons. In this iteration, the witch's sin is not only magic, but vanity, jealousy and ambition. In other words, an older woman who dares to want anything. Great artists of the Renaissance and Baroque, including Goya, Dürer and Bruegel, created some of the most terrifying images of witchery, based not on lived reality, but on theological invention. Goya's Witches' Sabbath, 1789 in 1. Dark nightmare of a scene. Witches pray before a giant black goat, the devil. Children lie at their feet. The women look frenzied, animalistic. Goya was not exactly promoting these views. He was satirizing his era's paranoia. But the picture fed into mass hysteria. Albrecht Dürer, which riding backwards on a goat, 1500s credit. Albrecht Dürer, Iten Wu by Mel. Dürer es fecund imagination would have thrilled to these strange times. This woodcut depicts a naked hag, her hair whipped by the breeze as she rides a goat, the standard image of the devil. She is not alluring, she is grotesque. The message is clear. The power of women is unnatural, and it is destructive. These were not only art, these were ideological weapons that reinforced the church's story and the culture's fears of women acting outside their roles. The witch followed as new technologies emerged, adapting, mutating, but always lurking. The theatre which Shakespeare's Macbeth, 1606. 3 witches appear to open the play, intoning double toil and trouble. They are cryptic. amoral, prophecy givers. Shakespeare's witches are not minions of Satan. They are agents of chaos, women who see too much and say too little. They manipulate, they foretell, they upset the order. That's what makes them frightening Hollywood. Witches from scare to snicker in the 20th century. The Witch Went Mass.A. Evil Witches, The Wizard of Oz, 1939. Wicked Witch of the West, Green Broomstick Riding, Power-Mad.Suspiria, The Craft, Rosemary's Baby, The Witch, as Clandestine Cultist, Temptress, Destroyer, Be Good Witches, but Still Weird, Bewitched, 1960s. Samantha is enchanting, suburban, but she has to hide her powers. Charmed, Sabrina, Harry Potter. Witches are endearingly weird outsiders. These looks evolve over time, and like everything else in the culture, reflect something about its attitude. With the advent of feminism, interest in witches as empowered figures rose, but still, in many ways, within limits, still tamed or Witches used to cower in the shadows, in forests, in kitchens, in silence. Now, they are in plain sight. They are coders and caretakers, poets and protesters, farmers, therapists, dancers, doulas. They are not defined by cauldrons or cloaks, but by clarity, conviction, choice. Because what a witch is in the future has nothing to do with its system work. Contemporary witches are not merely resisting the old world, but are also in the process of creating the new one. Rebuilding, not just rebelling. Yes, witchcraft has always been resistance, but the new wave. Its construction. Witches are building communities that are based on mutual aid, not hierarchy. They're transforming rituals into group therapy, spell work into environmental activism, tarot into tools for reflection, full moon circles into sites of communal healing. And it's not fantasy, it's blueprint, which collectives are rewriting urban farming policies. Magical practitioners are actually teaching trauma-informed care. There are covens raising money for reproductive rights and trans liberation. Forget the sabbats on mountaintops, the future turning of the wheel. These new rituals held in libraries, Discord servers, above garden beds, inside voting booths. Technology, as alchemy. The internet didn't kill witchcraft, it broadened it. Witches are tech-savvy, via app notifications, sigils designed on graphic tablets, spells shared as Instagram carousels. The pace of Wi-Fi activism. They are coding protection spells into social platforms. They're blending AI with astrology. Now they are using blockchain to decentralize sacred knowledge. It's not just about the nostalgia of ancient times. It's about integrating ancient thought in futures. The future which is fluid. Not all witches are women. Not all witches are white. Not all witches are binary. Not all witches even identify as witches. And that's the point. The future witch is the one who will never be made to doubt their knowing, and will never allow themselves to be molded by fear. They are who cross-pollinate both Venus and Mars. They are immigrants integrating ancestral ritual with pop culture. They are witches who are disabled and rewriting accessibility into magical practice. They are the offspring of colonized lands, spinning stolen symbols into sacred tales. The witch to come is not a single image. They're a prism. What they teach us that softness is power, that listening is revolution, that mystery, of course, is not the adversary of truth, but the fount of it, that healing is not weakness, it is strategy, that beauty and rage are not contradictory, but allies. They teach us to unlearn, to unsilence, to unfollow what does not serve. Witchcraft as world-building. The future of witchcraft doesn't hinge on proving it is real. It's about asking what's possible. Can a ritual reclaim a body? Can a spell rewrite a trauma? Can a story undo centuries of disgrace? Yes, yes, yes. That's because witches don't simply endure the world. They remake it. One symbol, one story, one spark at a time. Witches don't just cast spells, they cast stories. And the most powerful spells of all, the ones we inhabit without even knowing. That's the final frontier. Witchcraft, not only as resistance, or healing, or belief, but as to making. The art of weaving the world anew, because everything you know about power, gender, truth, beauty, danger came from a story somebody told you. Witches are rewriting those stories. Myth, as magic from ancient epics to Netflix shows. Myths shape our conception of reality, and for hundreds of years the witch got written out, or written wrong. She was the villain, the madwoman, the punishment. Now, she's the protagonist. Contemporary witches know that narrative is perception, that to control the story is to control what is perceived to be true, and perception is power, so they tell new stories, of birth as strength, not vulnerability, of age as wisdom, not decay, of mystery as a gateway, not an issue, of community not as chaotic, but as spellcraft. They are not so much teaching history as ritualizing it. They not only remember their ancestors, they are their ancestors. They don't consume culture so much as enchant it. Witchcraft in music, fashion, and art. Editorial staff, everyone knows by now that witchcraft is trending. In fashion, you've seen it, heard it, felt it. In music, from Stevie Nicks to FKA Twigs, from the sonic spells of Björk to Billie Eilish's gothic glamour, sound becomes incantation. Lyrics become hexes and hymns. In fashion, pointy hats are out, but capes are in. Flowing silhouettes, sigil embroidery, lunar prints. Every rag of cloth a shield, every outfit a pronouncement. Art, altars in the galleries, tarot decks as visual language, spells rewritten as signs, sigils in street murals, ceremonial aesthetics in TikTok edits. It isn't aesthetic for the sake of being aesthetic. It's a visual language of memory. Digital mythology. The internet is not just a network, it's a myth machine. Memes are modern sigils. Viral trends are digital rituals. Profile bios are grimoires of identity. Witches use these tools consciously, reframing algorithms as alchemy, translating virtual exposure into targeted intention, making art that heals, producing content that shines rather than chucks shade. Cultural memory work. Witchcraft today reveres the voices history sought to silence. It's not just about ritual, it's about memory. The midwives labeled monsters, the enslaved healers whose wisdom was taken, the queer mystics who lived between. Memory is sacred. And today's witches archive it not in tombs, but in tweets, in tattoos, in podcasts, in performance. They are mythmakers with microphones, historians with herbs, healers with Aishash tags. Collective imagination, a spellwork to alter the future. You must imagine it first. Women who are witches, if anyone understands that, it's them. Every time that you say, I see a world where you are casting a spell, every protest chant, every speculative story, each poem, each vision board, each moonlit journal entry, these are the rituals of world builders, and witches are at the front of the charge, not with fear, with futures. They're asking, what if justice were to appear like healing? What if safety didn't need to be policed? Imagine if spirituality was integrative, intuitive, embodied. What if power is caring, not control? These are not questions for philosophy class. They're blueprints, they're magic. So here we are, 13 chapters, 13 spells, 13 mirrors facing a history that worked so hard to forget its own power. But witches remember. They remember the screams, the silence, the blacked-out names on court documents, lost herbs pressed within pages, the dances outlawed, the dreams ridiculed, the rituals hidden beneath ash and shame. And still, they return. Witches are the echo after the voice has waned, the spark that escaped the water, the page that changed the ending. Because here's the thing, they never actually burned the witches. They burned women, they burned wisdom, they incinerated whatever would not kneel. But the spirit, the spark, it never went out, it waited, in lullabies, in laughter, in soil, in symbols. Until it could rise again, louder, weirder, wiser. Today, there are many ways to be a witch. It means asking the questions no one wants to ask. It is about selecting your own tools and truths. It means mending wounds that never received decent burials. It signifies happiness in opposition, tenderness against wrath, wielded responsibly. It's not always pretty. It's never perfect. It's powerful. And now, dear reader, dear listener, dear believer or skeptic, you are part of the circle as well. You've read the stories. You've felt the fire. You've traveled through the forest, through the scrolls, through the myths and the mirrors. So what now? That is up to you now to determine what you bring with you, what to question, what to bless. You choose what kind of witch you will be. If not in name, then in nerve. The witch being no costume. She's a compass, not a relic, a revelation. And the story doesn't end here. It spirals, it sparks, it repeats. So light your candle, plant your seed, name your fear, name your power, and never forget, the circle is never broken, only begun again.